Welcome to the annual interview.
Welcome to the annual conference on cultural diplomacy. Today we have Lord Jack McConnell, former First Minister of Scotland. Today, would you mind us we ask you a few questions?
Of course.
Should there be...
Too late now.
Okay, yeah. First question. Should there be an increase in cultural diplomacy programs in the public sector? I.e., should we include the programs as an integral part within the Ministries of Defence, etc.?
I think it would be important to include them not just in the Ministry of Defence, but across any ministry that is dealing with international relations. So, in addition to the Foreign Service, you have the whole development and aid department of the government, but also trade, tourism, all these different areas where there's an interaction between one country and another. There should be the ability, I think, or the opportunity to learn about cultural diplomacy and to have those values as part of your education for your career.
Do you share our idea that cultural diplomacy programs can reduce the likelihood of war?
Well, that's the main reason I'm here. For me, cultural diplomacy is an attitude of mind. It is about the way that we relate to other people on the planet, the way that, particularly that decision makers, understand the context in other countries, both the history, but also the contemporary context, the customs, the expectations. And I think through a greater understanding of other cultures, and not just a tolerance of other cultures, but a celebration of other cultures, then I think you can have both conflict resolution and conflict prevention. And that's my main motivation for being here at ICD.
So do you think also the private sector should include cultural diplomacy programs into their work, for example, in social responsibility initiatives?
Well, I think it's probably important in social responsibility initiatives, and it's maybe not immediately obvious to everyone why the private sector would have an interest in this area. But I think as successful companies are global companies, or at least have some form of global trade or maybe global procurement, or are just simply dealing with diverse communities at home, I think there is a need for forward-looking private companies to understand other cultures. So, for example, the most successful European companies in China are those who genuinely understand Chinese culture and the way that decisions are made in China, the history behind those, the development of communities and companies in China. So that's just one example. It's very important at the moment. I think for the private sector, yes, in their social responsibility programs, they should be thinking about this. But in some ways, it's possibly even more important that as part of their mainstream thinking and the training of their senior managers and those who represent their company abroad, that those people understand other cultures and the importance of other cultures just as much as people in the public sector or normal diplomacy would.
Do you think cultural diplomacy would be best served if the Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Culture were to create a department entirely devoted to this concept?
My own view would be best located in the Foreign Service, because ultimately that's where relations are most influenced, and most other departments in a government will look to the Foreign Service for guidance on the relationship with a particular country. Even in departments that have a lot of, or ministries that have a lot of work abroad, whether that be the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry for International Development and Aid, or Ministry for Tourism, or the Ministry of Defence, those departments will take their political and to some extent cultural lead from the diplomats in the Foreign Service. So I would say that cultural diplomacy should be an integral part of the work of the Foreign Service, but in carrying out that work, they should be trying to influence in other departments and mainstream that across the work of government.
Lord McConnell, this question has to do actually with the UK. Can you please explain the Scottish position on remaining within the UK? Can you elaborate on the reasons behind this? How would this affect Scotland's relationship with the EU?
Well, this is a very topical issue in Scotland just now, and it's in some ways a very complex issue, but for me, a very straightforward issue. I supported all my adult life the idea that Scotland should have some home rule, some devolution of power to our elected parliament inside the United Kingdom. I think it makes sense on the islands of the United Kingdom for there to be a common government that looks after the common interests of all those who live there. And we now have so much shared history and such an integrated economy, for example, that I think that continues to make sense. But within the United Kingdom, it has been important to recognise that there are national identities that are very distinct, and ours is perhaps the most distinct, but there are others too. And so therefore home rule within the UK was, for me, always the best policy. It remains the best policy. And I think those who advocate independence, in my view, are turning the clock back. That what Scotland needs to do today is to relate more to the rest of the world, to be more outward looking, to be more open. And I think nationalism and the debate around becoming independent and splitting off from the rest of the UK turns us inwards. It turns us to look more internally. And in my view, in today's world, that's a bad thing. So, I think we face a real important moment in our history here. At the moment, support in Scotland is about 50-50 between separating and not separating. So there is going to be a big debate over the next 3 years and a big vote, and that vote will be final. It will could change our whole history. But I hope that we take the sensible decision, which is to have control over most of our own domestic affairs, but at the same time be part of an integrated, multinational form of government, almost a multilateral form of government in the United Kingdom.
Fair enough.
It's my turn.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Regarding your recent presence in Congo, I would like to ask your opinion about the role that the African Union should have with regards to the electoral democratic process in African countries, and how can they facilitate this when so many African countries do not have democratic voting process themselves?
My answer relates both to the African Union and to the regional organisations. The regional organisations are not strong in every part of the continent. There's no real regional organisation for North Africa. The North African states really participate more maybe in the Arab League than in a North African association. And the regional organisation in Central Africa is weak, mainly because the states there are quite weak. But in West Africa and in East Africa and in Southern Africa, the regional organisations are, if anything, stronger than the African Union. So I suppose my answer really relates to those three regional organisations as well as the AU itself. And I think their role today is really important, and in the future is absolutely critical. To me, when I was in the Congo observing the election, it was good to be there from Europe, and I was very proud to be part of it, and I could see that local people appreciated us being there and providing some reassurance for them, some guidance for them sometimes, helping with their complaints, and afterwards hopefully an independent observation. But I was even more pleased to see, and I spent some of the day with the South African Development Conference, Development Community's Observer Mission, who'd come from Angola and Mozambique and Tanzania, and they were just as involved as we were, if not more so. And the AU had a mission as well. I didn't meet them during the day, but the AU had a mission there too. And I think the role of these organisations is partly an election observation when the elections take place, but it's also an intervening in advance to make sure that elections take place. There are too many examples over the continent in the last 30, 40 years where presidents have decided that only they can run the country forever, and it takes pressure sometimes from your neighbours and friends to say, no, you have to go after 2 terms, the Constitution says that, and we won't deal with you if you break that Constitution. So the creation of democratic elections is best done by the African Union, not by the UN or the Europeans, but by the neighbours. And similarly afterwards, when there's a disputed result, again, the intervention is far more successful if it's by the neighbours. If the neighbours say, you lost the election and you have to go, as happened this year in the Ivory Coast, then I think that's much more powerful than it being seen as some intervention from the Northern Hemisphere. So I think at the moment this role for the EU that's very different from its predecessor and has been developing over the past 10 years is a really good role, and it will change, is already changing the face of constitutional governance in Africa and in many countries. And I think what we need to do in the Northern Hemisphere is to support those institutions and invest in the African Union, invest in the regional organisations, because if we can build up their infrastructure, they can do more of this, and it will have it will be a real sustainable change in countries if it's done in partnership with neighbouring countries rather than imposed from a distance.
My last question will be regarding your speech. In your lecture yesterday, you mentioned something about that is not how much is reaped, but how much is sown. How much is reaped, but how much is sown? What about the soil where these seeds are planted? Shouldn't the source be held more accountable for development challenges instead of just reforming Western institutions? Shouldn't there be like a similar pressure to reform the South, to reform the developing country, to reform Africa and their institutions?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think the reality is that seeds grow best in good soil. And to use your prompt, and I think if we should be investing more in the longer term. First point, but we can do that more successfully, where the institutions of government are legitimate, where there are independent institutions that provide a form of balance and a check on government, and where governments are elected properly by the people and have a clear strategy that we can support. So that is why I believe very strongly that while we should be supporting education programs, and we should be supporting health vaccination programs, and we should be supporting water programs, and it is important that aid is directed to these individual aims. In some ways, in the long term, it's even more important that we support security systems, that we support governance improvements, and that we support the regional institutions that will help make them work in reality. So, in many ways, the point I was trying to make by that phrase yesterday was that yes, we have to plant more seeds. Certainly have to harvest a bit less, but also we need to make sure, yes, that the soil is strong enough that the seeds take hold.
Thank you. So I would be happy to welcome you for the EU-Africa Alliance Conference, or for the AU Conference in London. Just let me know when you're available.
When is this?
The EU-Africa Alliance in Berlin in January, and the AU Conference in February in London. Okay, so I will. Yeah, will be.
If I'm in London, of course I will.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.